so many familiar faces. It's really nice to have you all here. As you know, Europe Week 2018 is our third installation of Europe Week, and we are thrilled to be able to do this with generous funding from the EU delegation in Washington, D.C. So let's all thank the EU, and for so many reasons, but also so that we can do these kinds of events. And I also have been instructed and would like to point out that you all have evaluations on your chair. Please fill them out. All of your information goes not only to us for important feedback on how to do things better, but it also actually goes to the EU to let them know how much we are informing folks about the EU and how important our work is. So we take those really seriously, so thanks for doing that. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ingo Peters this evening. He has been a long-standing colleague in the Transatlantic Masters program. He is currently an associate professor of political science at the Freie Universität Berlin, as well as the executive director of the Center for Transnational Relations, Foreign and Security Policy. His teaching and research activities focus on German foreign policy, European security governance, and transatlantic as well as international relations. He is one of the coordinators, or our Freie University site director, for the Transatlantic Masters program, as well as the sister Euromasters program. He's also a member of the steering committee for the Master of Arts program, International Relations, or the MAIB, as we call it in German, which is a program offered jointly by the Freie University, the Humboldt, and the University of Potsdam, so a real Berlin-Brandenburg collaboration. And when I asked Ingo about what he would like me to be sure to mention tonight is that he is also a proponent of international exchange and really values the student exchange across the Atlantic through the TAM program, of course, but also in other ways. The undergraduate FU Best or the FUBIS Summer University or different exchange programs we have that UNC has with the Free University, for example. And has been involved in the TAM program since 1998, since its inception, really since Euromasters began in '96. And full disclosure, I was in Ingo Peters' class in January of 1999, so we've known each other a long time, and I still talk about the grade I got on that paper.
No negotiation.
No, none. It's a big deal. Ingo is also currently the Dean of Studies in her third term, which means that he's in charge of all of the degree programs at his institute, which is 6 undergraduate and 13 master's programs. And that means that he is, on the one hand, engaging in teaching and research, but also he's managing these administrative duties, managing the degree programs, which includes student concerns and quality management. So you really covered all. So we're really looking forward to your talk tonight. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Katie, for this polite introduction. I very much appreciate the invitation, first of all. Thanks, John Stevens, for coming, Lisbeth, Katie, and Sarah. Sarah sitting there, she is. We are closely cooperating in the TAM program for years now, and it has been a real pleasure to go to Chapel Hill, to work with you, and to come back to Chapel Hill, especially with such a lovely scenery here and the lovely weather for a change. So first of all, you know, I want to put on my glasses, and I have on my jacket, so I think that's enough of giving you the impression that I'm supposed to be the professor. May I take off the jacket? No offense? No? Okay. Just, you know, this is supposed to be work, so we have to do it this way. Okay, the topic is clear from, as you can read it here, and as Katie pointed out, you know, my understanding is always, and I think I learned it from an American professor who called himself, even though he was a senior professor, a student of something. So I always conceive of myself as a student of international relations, though I'm now in my 74th semester. So, okay, I took some degrees and so forth, but just to give you this kind of identity issue kind of clarification. And if I speak about such a topic, and you know, I hope that this title will actually actually, given all the talk I'm going to give will do justice to the title. However, I have to come up with at least two disclaimers. One is just from the very beginning that nobody's upset if I talk time and again about the EU and the US. You know, I always tell my students if I talk about and teach transatlantic relations or whatever kind of international relations, that neither the EU nor the US is a unified actor. This almost goes without saying, but just to prevent these kind of questions, of course, I'm aware that on both sides of the Atlantic there are pluralistic kind of societies, and in the European Union even nation states combined, integrated more or less. And so, of course, it's just an even-handed kind of statement that one says EU-US relations, and maybe one has to go into the nitty-gritties once we talk about details. The other point I would like to make for the experts around is what kind of thing can you expect? My overall research design is following a bottom-up approach in a way. So I'm a convinced bottom-up person, and I don't start doing theory testing here, not just because I know here might not just be a group in front of me studying international relations at the university, but also people from the public and so forth. That's not the only reason why I do this, but I'm deeply convinced that it's important, first of all, to describe systematically what you're talking about, what your subject is, then to evaluate, and this will be the major part of this, evaluate the quality of the relationship and make some offers regarding methods appropriate for doing this. And then later on, you know, and I will come to speak about that as well, to bring up some discussion of causal kind of relations, of factors that might determine or influence the quality, whether we talk about cooperation, conflict, or crisis of transatlantic relations, the quality of this relationship. And since it's once again said to be under stress, I think this is very appropriate. You know, every other year you can do such a presentation on this topic. You will see that this is already one of my basic messages. This caricature, and I apologize for forgetting to indicate the source actually, but I like caricatures. You know, they always have a message to bring across, and everybody might view this from a different angle and come up with different suggestions. You know, of course, you know this guy in front of you. You elected him, and this person is now gone, as far as I know. But still, this caricature, this drawing, in a way, contains the main message. And my main message is here: this telephone kind of cable from the U.S. administration to the Europeans. You know. And this is what we're talking about. So you'll understand why I stress the meaning of the telephone connection here later on, I guess. At the same time, it gives us another kind of message, I think, this picture, which is, you know, sometimes the US administration helps to unify the Europeans. They rally around the flag, you know. And that has also been the case throughout the history of the European integration process. Whenever there was stress in transatlantic relations, the Europeans were more able to act as a unified kind of bunch of states and governments than at times when there was more or less, you know, harmony sort of thing and business as usual. So I might also come back to that, you know. But you have heard, of course, as students of European studies or whatsoever, that it's not always easy to agree on policy issues inside the community, although it's a very special club with integrated pillars and not so much integrated pillars and so forth. But we don't talk about the nitty-gritties about the integration process at this point. The agenda. Now, you know, this is, we might come back to this. The agenda is very comprehensive in a way, but you will see that I also I am a deep believer in the meaning of history for helping us to understand current affairs. So this history, of course, is not going back to Christopher Columbus necessarily, but you know, at least to the end of the Second World War. And I draw on all these topics. There are no numbers in front of this. This would be too much of a systematic approach, but you know, then here at this point we'll come to current affairs, and so just to give you a clue of what you can expect, and now the more detailed kind of story I'm going to tell you. And as you know, there are always different stories to tell, so this is only my story. If you have questions, let's say easy or small questions, please feel free to ask immediately, but if it's a question that needs discussion, I think we have to postpone it to the end. Yeah? But clarifications or abbreviations or whatsoever, you know, the social scientists are almost as bad if it comes to abbreviations as the EU is. Yeah? So inventing 10,000 abbreviations every day. The first starting point here, the first point I would like to make is that, you know, really after the end of the Second World War, the transatlantic relations started not from scratch, of course, but it was a new kind of phase of world history, people say, regarding the emerging East-West conflict, and the western parts of it, of course, with the leadership of the United States, and the United States' commitment to Europe was clearly visible on the one hand by the Marshall Plan, and on the other hand by its important role as a security provider in and for Western Europe vis-a-vis the Cold War scenery and the Soviet US Western Eastern confrontation. So this is just an important statement, since it's, you know, a starting point where the relationship was still very asymmetric from my standpoint. Yeah? The US was unquestionably the dominant power in this relationship, providing for security in economic terms. So, you know, Europe was just a receiver. But this is important to see that this basic figure or this basic structure of the relationship changed over time, has changed over time. And at least I think since the 1970s, the experts that I had to read when I was a student told me that a lot of things are changing in terms of economic performance on the European side and so forth. But still, during the days of the Cold War, the reliance on US security provision was heavily coining the quality of this relationship with US leadership, and always attempting to get something in return from the Europeans in terms of burden sharing and so forth. Endless debates in the 1960s, 70s and so forth, and still today, as we will see later on. So this is an important starting point. And I'll come now simply up with a list. You will have different lists from my side. I love lists since they tell a long story and cut it short in a way. So I'm not going to read it out, but it will not be the last one. So this is simply indicating the disputes, not to use yet the term of a conflict or crisis or cooperation, but disputes just as in kind of alternative term here. And you might or might not be aware of the individual events, but you know, that's not important. One can talk about this or can write books about every single case here, or you have a selection of these in an edited volume of, I don't know, 500 pages, and so everything is possible. But you know, it's just the message that has to come across. I'm continuing here with the first Bush administration of senior Bush, and then with Junior and Obama. And these are just some cross-cutting or major issues, one might say. And you know, this is just to point out the general picture, that the transatlantic relationship overall can easily be described as a history of conflicts, a history of disputes. And as for me, this is also a very important message I like to bring across. This is not bad. This is quite normal. I will elaborate on this later on. So, you know, and it's also indicating that a list of disputes on multiple issues. So it's not just security, it's not just regional policies, it's not just about arms control or defense policy and trade, but it's also about supposed minor issues. Another premise that I like to introduce is simply not just economic, but this picture is just to illustrate the economic interdependence with rather new numbers here from the Commission at the United States. The figures are mixed here, so we made a choice and made the whole slide a transatlantic endeavor in a way. This is just to indicate, you know, what is at stake. We talk about transatlantic relations, and you know, this some people tend to forget once in a while that this is not you know, just done for you and me, but for our societies and for the West as a whole. You could say, if there is something left from the concept of what the West is. All these, you know, indicators here in terms of categories, and then the indicators of the leading partners of international trade. It's still, you know, it's despite all the talk about the rise of China and the force, it's still us in a way that dominates those simple or not. If we don't dominate, we at least contribute to a significant degree to 1/3 of the trade flows and so forth. And we are each other's single largest trading partners, which is also here then going to the foreign direct investment and so forth. And here, this is also an indicator for how interdependent we are. So if our presidents and if their administrations and if we as societies do a bad job, then these jobs may be at stake. Yeah, so this is not nothing to talk about this. And as I said, the problem is, you know, that interdependence is not an objective kind of given thing, but it's most important that our chiefs of government realize this, of course. You know, it doesn't help if you just come up with these figures, but they have to internalize it and accept it and grasp it. Yes, this is a foundation for which we have to deal with each other. So this is also sounds like a very facile kind of statement, but it's a very important premise to see that, yes, from my way of describing it, is an interdependent relationship, and so there's something at stake, but it doesn't help if those who are responsible for policy making don't realize it. Okay, then, you know, with the list of conflicts we saw earlier, we have to talk about the end of the East-West conflict, or what over here in the US is more often called the end of the Cold War, 1989, fall of the wall, and the end of the dividing line in Europe and beyond, of course. You know, then was a time to say, hey, where do we stand? And the politicians were very inventive, and one could say, you know, the Europeans have always been accused by the Americans, if I may speak in these easy-handed terms, that they are good at institution building. So since they agreed on a lot of institutions in transatlantic dialogue, you might say maybe this was dominated by the Europeans, you know. So let's talk about capabilities on the other hand, in terms of what's the substance here. It's not just about the military relationship or security relationship, of course. But as we can see from documents like the Transatlantic Agenda 1990-92 and the dialogue and so forth, and these institutions were invented to actually provide a structure for a kind of systematic order process of negotiations if we have issues at hand, you know. And this is also very important, the institutional backup of the relationship. It's organized, it's not just ad hoc a relationship, but it's structured and institutionalized, as one Professor Pollack said once. It's highly institutionalized, but only shows a low degree of integration. You know, this doesn't involve any kind of putting your own vote into question. There's no majority voting going on. This is just the structure facilitating negotiations in the first place. And as we learned later on, let me be frank about this, some of the institutions have broken down since then. But you can actually try to find out which one still work and which don't. So for example, all these kind of, it sounds European or looks European with all the abbreviations again. The transatlantic business dialogue, for example, I learned these kind of dialogues had the tendency to run empty after a while. So we always have to say, it's nice to have institutions, but institutions only can help if they do their job, if they can fulfill their function as a structure providing for coordinated negotiations and exchange of views. With the 1990s, the discussion started concerning the security pillar here. Where is it? Here. Where you could add, of course, say, one arrow goes to NATO as one of the backbones of transatlantic relations, as I indicated from the very beginning. And there was a discussion, you can find it still in the journals, the books of that time. Is NATO useful anymore, or should we do away with it? Or what is it? What could be the new functions? And there are lovely articles, if you want to have some recommendations, no problem, with this institutional change involved in the changing times of those days in the early 90s and so forth. And we have to know, that this is also a symbol for going beyond NATO. It's strongly economic integration here, not integration but institutionalization. It's dealing with political pillars and the cultural issues. The societal bit is also taking note of. So in European language, we would say this seems to be quite a comprehensive approach to transatlantic relations. I'm not in favor of the use of the term in European Union documents, but here maybe I am allowed to make fun of it for a little bit. So I come up with my second set of conflicts of issues, and I'll come up with some conceptual issues after this, but simply to indicate that despite the whole setup of structures and institutions, we still had to face a lot of disputes in transatlantic relations, and these tables are taken from my 2006 book, and it's simply systematizing, it's again a description, systematizing the findings of a literature review in certain policy fields, areas, issue areas, if you like, and then sorted according to a level of analysis kind of categories here. As you can see, some abbreviations might be telling to you, others not. As I said, you don't have to take the details so much, but if any questions come up, we'll see whether I have something to say about this. And then there's another one. This is the same structure, but no longer security, but welfare and economics. Just indicating, despite the end of the Cold War, or some say just because of that, we faced a lot of conflicts, a lot of disputes. But as indicated, that's not true. If you know about the history, even before the end of the Cold War, we had a lot of troubles in a way. It was never easy to cooperate. And you might say cooperation among democracies, as Tom Harris's book tells us, is never easy and never a one-way street. But here, again, a short list of issues that was found in the pertinent literature of the, say, first 10 years of the 2000s. And second category here, order and governance, also not as long as the other list with issues, but even the US Embassy in Berlin was discussed at that time, and that's of course for the very experts of the US security concerns and whether or not the state of Berlin would allow the US to extend its ground on which the new embassy was built. and therefore even changed the course of a whole street. And that was debated, between the city of Berlin, you could say, and the US government to some degree, but of course the ambassadorial kind of level or embassy issues are also of concern to the federal government. Okay, this is just a summary view, and I'm now turning to a little bit more detail in what happened when last time, I think, when people were really concerned about transatlantic relations, and that was when after the horrible events of what is it here, of 9/11, and so this was, of course, then the issue of Iraq war. And it's important to put everything into quotes in a way, since all these terms are very ambiguous. But here it's clear that this was overall, as an international crisis, a crisis about peace and war vis-a-vis Saddam Hussein's Iraq in a way. But it was not an issue of peace or war regarding transatlantic relations. That's why the red in is so important, and here hold it up. And however, transatlantic disputes of that time were about how to handle the internal conflicts of how to deal with Saddam Hussein and the challenges that his regime posed for the West, for the US, for, in terms of supporting transnational terrorism, as much as for his strive to acquire weapons of mass destruction. As you can see, here I come up with the first definition, but it's not my favorite one, but it's one definition of what a crisis could be: a risky situation of imminent choice concerning the mode of conflict resolution. But not so much, this could be applied to the overall international level as much as to transatlantic relations. So the choices you have as politicians representing your societies are important, and the mode that this takes will be important for the further understanding of my message here. So what was it about? Who is old enough to remember, or who has studied it in detail, I don't know. But hopefully you are young enough to know nothing about this, but still, there is something in here. And I simply summarized it in 3 bullet points here. And this was simply telling us, or this bullet points are simply telling us that there were different views on how to deal with certain things, like the use of force, like the requirements for authorizing the use of force via a United Nations mandate or not enter force, an old issue of transatlantic relations. It's even an issue on the European agenda for themselves. It's sometimes not easy to agree on this. And the last point here, of course, is the meaning using force, the disagreement on the actual meaning of using force, what kind of force, for what purpose, and so on. So this is just indicating what it was in substance about. Again, analyzing this is also telling us stories that if we talk about the Iraq war, it's not just talking about the divides across the Atlantic, but it's part of it. Therefore I say it's more than just the transatlantic relationship, but beneath this, it was also, in a way, a challenge for the US, when it divided Europe, those in support of military engagement in Iraq, and the old Europeans, which were hesitant, like France and Germany, and after all, they came to the conclusion not to join the alliance or the coalition of the willing to fight war, and the new Europeans, however. So this is against the backdrop of European enlargement in 2004, and the discussion of this already in 2001, 2, 3, so to say. So there was a competition regarding the travel to Washington, D.C. and telling the U.S. president, we are with you or we are against you, by the way. As Bush, or rephrasing Bush, who said to the Europeans, either you're for us or you're against us. And this sounds quite familiar if you read the newspapers or listen to the news these days. And this was overall also questioning the viability of Western institutions, since, as I indicated, institutions are meant to facilitate cooperation. But it doesn't help if people don't recognize the purpose of these institutions and what is at stake in terms of at stake for both sides. You know, so that was also important point. What is really interesting, however, is now to have a look onto what the academia had to say about this. So I'm not going to cite politicians, strange kind of people anyway, but what about academia, the analysts telling us about this? And you know, you can see here very different qualifications. From the American side, Shepard, what is the greatest transatlantic split since Suez? This is since '56. Then deepest EU divide here. This is also just a qualification of the relationship as the deep crisis by Thomas Risse with my boss in Berlin, and we closely cooperate on this, and you will see some other things relating to his writings here later on. So it's a deep crisis. And Gordon and Shapiro say it's the worst crisis for more than 50 years. Damn hell, this must be a serious kind of time then. And here even topped by Elizabeth Pond, which she was always walking on the knife's edge here, one leg in journalism, one leg in social sciences, and she was brave enough to call it the near death of transatlantic relations, or the alliance. The alliance is just NATO, or the broader concept of it. And, you know, she was talking about the war. You know, this is alarmism. Got the pronunciation. I have to get the pronunciation right. So, and the question against this backdrop, from my interest as a student of this, is of course to say, what the hell is a deep crisis? What is a crisis, and what is a deep crisis? And what are the other kind of crises? The worst crisis, and on the lower end of the scale, and the near death. What comes after the death of transatlantic relations? Nothing? You know? Will we simply roll into different directions? You know? I don't know. And the war, I think it was overdone. You know, it would still, if we have to read it, and I think it's in the making. So the following months, you will have the pleasure to read new accounts of transatlantic relations. It normally takes a year until we are ready to come up with qualifications of what kind of relationship we are in today. So this brought me to the issue of, you know, what comes after Bush, what comes after the irritations, disputes on the Iraq War, and of course, you know, suddenly all of a sudden a new president seems to have changed the transatlantic kind of agenda, and a lot of people hoped for changes coming with this guy called Barack Obama. And of course, he was also good at making promises, and a lot of people say today that his promises were nice, but he wasn't able, or not willing, I don't know, but certainly not able to keep a lot of his promises. So, however, first of all, it was an important signal for the European partners that a new president was more relaxed on some issues, more European, which came to his disadvantage than in the internal discourse in the US, as we know. If you have the kind of reputation to be arguing like a European, that's no good for an American president, I guess. But still, for the Europeans, it was a sign of hope. And as you might know, when this guy was not, or I think he was already president-elect at that time, and he visited Berlin, it was, as if the Berliners had elected this guy. So this is important. And simply jump over one of my kind of slides here and simply indicate another set of issues where you can see that the Obama administration was, in a way, promising, as I said, not always keeping its promises, but promising to allow a recovery of transatlantic relations and re-energizing commitment to multilateral institutions and the fourth, including our US-European relationship. I turn now against this background just to indicate, it also depends on which administration is in power on this side, but also, of course, on the other side of the Atlantic. So, it's always important to realize if you talk about politics, you at least need, the old kind of phrase is always correct, I think, at least needs two for tango, If just one side is willing and able to cooperate, it's nice, but it's not enough. Okay. Having said this, I come up now with a little kind of excursion into conceptualizing the terms cooperation, conflict, and crisis, very briefly, in a way, so everything in a nutshell here. Against what I've told you so far, that there's no harmony in transatlantic relations, I claim is normal. We are pluralist societies in ourselves, and altogether we are democracies, supposedly. Yeah, let's hope the best. And with all the history of conflicts, it's just a normal kind of state of affairs. After all, democracy in itself is a certain kind of a political regime to sort out how conflicts are resolved in a society. And so, why should we wonder about having conflicts in transatlantic relations among our democratic societies, as long as we claim to be pluralists and so forth? It's normal. However, this is also to tell that conflicts are not always evolving into crisis, so we have to differentiate that in order to make sense of it. And here, of course, again, very often cited by many different professors working on transatlantic relations. One example again, Thomas Risse, Karl Deutsch's concept of a security community. So this is the concept used for saying what is about the very structure of the transatlantic relationship. And it says it's basically a community beyond the nation state, beyond the integrated structure of the European Union, a community of like-minded people, you could say, based on, in a way, on common interest, institutions, and common identity. So this, by the way, looks very straightforward, but we have to admit that here you also have a kind of almost invisible causal kind of statement, since, of course, the security community concept is an ideal type. And as soon as you have diverging interest and institutions and identity people, what is normatively or right, what are your norms and values you pursue in policy making, as soon as you have divergences or differences, the quality of the security community differs. And this is where it comes into the picture, so that I say these variations are important for qualifying cooperation, conflict, and crises. As you will see here, this also encompasses a definition of conflict here, and so this is just a straightforward basic definition you find also in conflict research and so forth. Okay, what to make of this now? I simply decided to draw on this and conceptualize two different qualities, basic modes of, where is it? No, this is already the next one. Okay, I apologize. I was confusing myself. So here, you know, the cooperative bit in transatlantic relations, I base back on Cohen's definition that we can deal with a process of adjusting initially different positions or preferences or interest, you might say, and so forth, based on the idea of we have something at stake, we have something in common, and these stakes are high for both sides, maybe different importance, but basically it's agreed that there is a need for cooperation, for the process of policy coordination. So this is also straightforward, I think, even for laypersons, that this could be, you know, if you can agree on compromises and so forth, if you don't have anybody around trying to dictate the other side of what they have to believe and what they have to do and which course of policy they have to pursue, everything is fine. Yeah, this is cooperation, working cooperation. So this is why I simply got a shortcut to crisis definition and conceptualization and say, as soon as we have a lack of successful cooperation of this process of adjusting policy making here, policies, then we might end up in a crisis. Yeah, so cooperation, fine. Conflicts, normal, but it depends on how these conflicts are resolved, and if we are not successful in solving our internal transatlantic issues cooperatively, then we might end up in crisis. Yeah? This is just an offer. Yeah? This is always my premise. I'm just making offers, suggestions, and there's no claim that this is the ultimate truth. This led me then to another overview of operationalizing this. Basically is a, surprise to myself, that was my student assistant, you know. Anyway, two modes of transatlantic, or qualities of transatlantic policy making here. The collaborative mode, and what is it? This is another challenge for German. The dissociative mode of cooperation, which is a low value for cooperation and a high valuation of cooperation. And then I established certain categories here, and then you might say criteria or even indicators inside the table itself. I'm of course not going to read it out. You just can get a glimpse of it, but the valuation of cooperation, do they go for cooperation, or do they say, I couldn't care less about my partners on the other side of the Atlantic? You know, are they willing and able to use institutions which they themselves establish, or do they simply say, forget about these institutions, I'm the big boss and tell you which way to go? Is of course important. Very nice. And this is continued simply two more categories indicating different qualities here, the flexibility and willingness to negotiate. You know, this is also inferred from the studying the early 2000s and the conflicts with the Bush administration, with Bush Junior administration, and of course always the question of what about words and what about deeds, you know, basic political science categories which are important, and not just for the American side. You may say this European is always, or maybe have in mind already, only the difference between words and deeds. On the American side, no, this trouble we also face on the European side. Not all the words that we can read in documents or statements should be taken at face value. Okay, if I come up with this, you know, this gives me an instrument to either say more or less, you know, the more I find in this category or that category, I can say that's a variation of the quality of transatlantic relations. You know, I don't put this into figures now, you know, I'm not a figures guy, but you have to interpret the statements of the policy-making processes in order to come up with the actual qualification of the state of affairs at a given point in time. Overall, this might lead then, to changes in transatlantic relations and the structures and processes. However, once again, I would like to stress, and this is also an important differentiation, that not every issue crisis is going to be a community crisis. Yeah? So if we talk about today, and I'll come to that in a second or 2 seconds, about trade crisis in trade relations among the Western partners here, it might be the crisis confined to trade, we don't know, but as soon as we have a spillover into other policy fields, then we might come closer to a community crisis, where the overall foundation of the relationship is questioned. Yeah? So, and then this may also end up in different ways of adjustment, of changes of the relationship, but I deliberately forgot about Elizabeth Bond's proposal to talk about the end of transatlantic relations. But I was reminded of Egon Spar's statements when he negotiated the Ostverträge in the early 1970s, when he said at the conclusion of the negotiations with the GDR, the 2 German states were negotiating, he said, until now we had no relations, now we at least have bad relations. Yeah? So, and even if we have bad relations, we still have relations. Yeah? This is something to nurture and to work on. I come up now with a lovely picture, which is telling us another story. Oh, there come some arrows. I'm sorry about this. I like arrows. Different colors. But look at this picture. What do you see? Yeah? I love this. I think it's very much symbolizing the dialogue of the dead. Yeah? Isn't it? If you have seen this on television in the original, it was amazing how Merkel was struggling to engage your president in talking to each other. But he was simply looking to the other side. This is telling about the mood, the status, maybe of affairs between the 2 persons here, but also, for some degree, regarding the relationship in the first year of the Trump administration. 2 quotes here, one from the election rally, this was a consequence also of Trump attending several summits and so forth, where he bullied some other partners, not so much Merkel. But one fallout of this kind of practice of transatlantic relation was her conclusion that it might be time to think about a basic change of this partnership. And this is also included in Trump's statement, so it just seems to refer to NATO. It was where the trouble started, and probably, this was the time, this wasn't a tweet, so at least something. And this is just, number 1 is it was obsolete, and then the interpretation started. What does it mean, obsolete? So he wants to abolish NATO. No, I think he was not choosing his word carefully enough, because he had, I think, not in mind to abolish it, but just to put pressure on the Europeans to think about what they contribute to the alliance. And this, however, and this is why I tell you, this is not a statement or a presentation that ends up in bashing Trump. This debate we know about if we are concerned about transatlantic relations, since I think it were the amendments to something in the 1970s already, when the US said, come on, improve your burden sharing. We are doing too much for you, the costs are too high, you are the consumers of security, so please back up your commitment to a transatlantic relationship. Nothing new. Yeah? But this is why history is so important. You get not so easily excited about things if you know about, earlier events. Another list of the real current agenda, 2018, European Union and the Trump administration. So reaching from climate change to the statements on Brexit, to other issues like North Korea or the other things that come to our mind. Here, in terms of the policy on Israel, the trade issues we'll go into later on, the CSDP things, you know, which are very ambiguous. And I think I'm going to republish my article I had in 2004 about the mutual ambiguity on both sides of the Atlantic. I can simply republish it and fill it with new empirical evidence, you know. And this is, of course, very nice. I don't know whether some publisher will accept it, but anyway. You know, this is more the current story of, you know, what people want. Without going into detail, I expect that at least some of you read the newspapers or listen to the news, and may it be online or otherwise, so some awareness of what is behind, maybe not each and every issue here, but some of these issues. And if you have further questions, please feel free. So the question derived from this is then coming up with my evidence regarding the quality, again, using the categories I introduced earlier on the quality of cooperation, dissociation or collaboration in a way. You remember, and I filled this out for, what is this? The Trump administration. And maybe I didn't get it wrong from your point of view, maybe I didn't get it right or only partially right, but this is, you know, storytelling. We can discuss it. But it's one story that you can hear on both sides of the Atlantic. That might be an adequate representation of what the Trump administration is doing in terms of appreciating cooperation across the Atlantic. It's a black and white picture, no doubt. And of course, think about counter-evidence, please. And the same, you know, which is now the white part of this picture, you know, the Europeans seem to be the good ones, you know, but be cautious. You know, I put it here in the words and deeds category again, that I'm not always sure, you know, that conflict arises or that we get to the brink of a crisis, the end of looking for solutions via negotiations, just because one side is failing to appreciate cooperation. And first of all, words and deeds, and then we can discuss it where we are. So I don't offer a final judgment on this, but I say at least maybe this black and white picture at least shows we are in trouble. Yeah, but then the individual judgment may be important, and of course, with the individual judgment also, what kind of evidence are you drawing on? It's not enough to come up with an hypothesis of where we stand, but it's always important to say, yes, I stand up for this hypothesis. This is backed up by this or that evidence. You know, that's what I also try to teach my students. So stereotypes on both sides, yes, of course. And here again, citing some famous professors is always good, isn't it? So, of course, here, as I said, various examples you might think of, but the examples we choose might also define the results we get. Yeah, so in different aspects, different realms of transatlantic relation, the status, the quality of cooperation, conflict crisis might be different still for the time being. So let's always state what we are talking about if we talk about this relationship. And, you know, again, this basic message, you know, I repeated time and again, now based on I think it was Stephen Krasner, the statement that we are living in an interdependent relationship where we are in any case better off if we reach cooperative agreements, since an interdependent relationship is defined as a relationship which is costly to break. Yeah, this is what I referred to earlier when I said this is not an objective statement of affairs, but it has to be in the mindset of the politicians to make it work. You know, you can not assume that this is an objective kind of description of affairs. So again, This is also, of course, then again leading back to our, just as an example, our slide we saw earlier. Is this valid and manifestation of what is at stake or not? What is better, to really go to war, trade wars, or is it better to continue to talk and find compromises? And I think I don't have to tell you what my favorite option is. I'm just trying to illustrate a little bit this part on, this is also why I bring this again here into the trade issues and the current discussion on the tariff issue with Trump in a way starting this, and people say, who wants a trade war? Nobody, but maybe we end up with one because nobody wanted it. Yeah. So be aware of it, and you have to take preventive action in a way. But this is also important table here, since it indicates again, I think, fair kind of statement in terms of this discussion was started by Trump, maybe, but the issue of tariffs is not just reserved for Trump and this administration, but tariffs are also practiced by the Europeans. Yeah? So it shows again that in different areas we have different kind of configurations of interest and values and I don't know what preferences. So you better negotiate than to blow all this up. So I hope to balance with this sheet here a little bit the more one-sided kind of tables I showed previously. This is another way of depicting the current discussion, and this is important here, that the green lights in a way are indicating cooperative moves, and the red ones conflictive kind of moves. And as you can see, the state of affairs is end of March here, so not too long ago. It's a mixed picture. It's not just confrontation, but there are negotiations going on. And as we know, for example, even though Trump seems to be worrying around his partners, not just China, but also the Europeans and South Korea and so forth with this tariffs. But as far as I know, for example, he also referred the Chinese case to the WTO, although he in some of his speeches or tweets discounts the WTO and say this is not worth being concerned about. But still, it seems to work even regarding him and his administration's work to some degree. And let's hope that this will, maybe we have another red light sometime, but that's where this row will not be continued by red all the time. Yeah, but this is just trying to give you a fair account of what kind of moves are made, and there are confrontative moves made by some Europeans, there are confrontative moves or cooperative moves by the US. So it's not easy just to tell the world that one side is guilty for pushing this for a test of the quality of transatlantic relations. A quick search in the internet showed me, and I was aware of it, that there was a similar kind of move by the Bush administration in 2002. And I just depict here, and I again, of course, don't read it out to you, but you can get a glimpse on what hopefully and supposedly experts had to tell about the implications of the tariffs disputes in the early 2000s. Yeah, and this is again, if you talk about a country like the US and talk about US industries and those who are interested in trade and so forth, they are not all in one camp. Yeah? So if I talk about tariffs on steel, one has to differentiate the steel producers in the US from those who are manufacturing steel. And this is also important, not to say, the Trump administration is just one-sidedly oriented towards the industry or so. Yeah, there are also opponents to his tariff policy coming from the inside and from the industries. So we are living in complex societies where even conflicts are, have more than two sides sometimes. So this is just, indication from one study of what the consequences, implications were, and maybe, if you're aware of any competing analysis of that time, please let me know. I'm always grateful for counter-arguments, but if not, please send these two slides to the Trump administration. Okay, I'm close to the end, and therefore it's just continuing. So we have to put this into perspective again, and I think this is all I did in a way, to put it in a long time and a not so long time perspective of what we have experienced in transatlantic relations, and then let's be less excited about what we see today, but still be aware that we have to act and that we have to come up with an opinion on this, and stances and comments and analysis on this, in order to provide politicians with well-informed, hopefully evidence-based arguments for continuing, if it was no longer for a community of necessity in view of a Soviet threat, maybe more about a community of choice. But maybe in times of globalization, in terms of the rise of China and the BRIC countries and so forth, you might say, come to the conclusion that we are back to a community of necessity to actually stand up for our Western values of enlightenment, with all the differences that we have to admit are existing on both sides, or even in countries, in different countries in Europe. Democracy or democratic political systems in France and Germany are quite different from the UK or the US and otherwise. So this is not the point. And again, the common interests have to be defined, they have to be recognized, and then we can use our institutions to try and sort it out against a more or less diverging, converging set of values and so again, ambiguities are existing on both sides. The final say here is that I would, I leave this kind of more elusive kind of statement with you for thinking about it. But one point for research to follow, since as a social scientist you have to know that you, on the one hand, have to claim you solved all the problems, and then you have to say how you have to continue the work. And this might be a lead question for everybody, under what circumstances are transatlantic partners actually able and willing, again, in quotes here, to uphold the collaborative mode of conflict resolution as the ultimate test of whether this community is alive or not. My final statement is, no, this is the final statement, a little bit overloaded with symbolism, so this is the bridge across the Atlantic, and this is our program here. So let's hope that we, as at least engage people with different mindsets, with different preferences, with different interpretations, still sit down on the same table in order to talk to each other and try to understand each other. That's why I'm here, and that's why I like to be here. Thank you for your attention and your patience. Yeah, whatever questions you might have, I want to open up this just by saying you can relate, of course, to the presentation, but if you have other questions regarding Europe, Germany, Berlin, Freie Universität, Department of Political Science, I don't know, Arbeitsstelle for something, you can ask everything. Yeah.
So you use the term values and norms, but one of the things that's being called into question now are what are the values and norms in the U.S. and in Europe, with the rise in Hungary, Poland, Italy of populism, maybe even neo-Nazism almost, that sort of thing. The question is, do the values and norms of the EU, are they really coherent